Hello, everyone. Welcome to the American Pharmacists Association podcast three-part series, What's New with the Flu for the 22-23 season. This series is supported by VaxServe. I'm Michael Hogue, and I'll be your host for this series of podcasts on the latest updates on influenza vaccine. Now, my background is as the Dean and Professor of Pharmacy at Loma Linda University in Southern California. I'm also a Professor of Preventive Medicine in our School of Medicine here. I serve as the liaison representative for APHA to the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. Now, today's episode is the second in a series of three podcasts. In the first episode, we discussed the different types of flu vaccines in the marketplace, how to select the appropriate age-based vaccine, and particularly we looked at populations who were 50 years of age and older who may have more risk. Today, we're going to focus on what's going on with flu right now. Recent data from the CDC indicates that we're experiencing the highest rate of influenza that we've seen in 10 years. So we're going to discuss this urgent need for getting more people immunized against the flu as quickly as possible and how pharmacists can be more proactive in helping to do that. I'm very pleased to welcome today an expert in this field, Dr. Jacinda Abdul-Mutakebbir, an assistant professor of pharmacy practice and critical care, an infectious disease specialist, a pharmacist at the Loma Linda University School of Pharmacy, and she's going to help us answer these questions. Jacinda, take just a moment and introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Jacinda Abdul-Mutakebbir, but I go by Dr. Jam or just, Jam in this conversation. So as Dr. Hogue, or as we call him at Loma Linda, Dean Hogue stated, I am an ID specialist. I trained in vitro pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics for antimicrobial resistance, but I've repurposed my talents and now I've been using them for education and vaccine equity. So I'm so excited to be here talking about influenza with you today, Dr. Hogue, Dean Hogue, if I can call you that, because that's what I call you every day.
Jacinda, it's great to be together with you to discuss this really important topic. I mean, the reality is that we have got a very serious flu outbreak happening. I mean, if we look, it's happening early. The Southern Hemisphere, this happened, and now it's happening here. We're seeing flu incidence rates and influenza-like illness rates, the highest that we've seen this early in the season over 10 years. It's really quite a critical situation. And unfortunately, the other thing we're seeing is that fewer people have gotten immunized against influenza this year compared to previous years. So what are the indicators telling us, Jacinda, that this season's a bad one? What are you seeing happen out there right now in the U.S. as it relates to the flu? And what do we need to be concerned about?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dean Hogue, for that question. And I want to start by stating that I am nervous about this flu season. I am very afraid for that. So when we think about just the rates that we're currently seeing with the infection, in 29 days, so from October 1st to October 29th, so let's say about 30 days, there were an estimated 3.7 million infections, influenza infections, reported by the CDC. So I think, it's important that we keep in mind that these are just estimates. So these numbers can be higher, but they're not very likely to be lower than what it is that the CDC reports. So that's just in a 30-day period. So not only are we seeing a ton of infections, but we can see how dire it is that these infections are that we're seeing because they're resulting in hospital visits. So of the 3.7 million, 1 million of those influenza infections resulted in someone feeling like they needed to go to the hospital. We're not saying that they're all ending up on that ventilator, but it's clearly not good. Even if folks are being managed outpatient, this creates a burden to the hospital system and one that's going to be additive considering the increases that we're seeing in COVID-19, considering the increases that we're seeing in RSV. So it's very scary what it is that we have out here. And then to put this even more into perspective, in the total flu season of last year, we saw 9 million infections. That was the total flu season. We're seeing almost half that number in a 30-day period. So these numbers are just going to increase. We have to make sure that we as pharmacists are thinking about vaccine uptake. And right now, currently, we have the lowest influenza uptake that we've seen in nearly a decade. So we need to be very, very vigilant and constantly thinking, how is it that we can contribute to increasing and promoting uptake within our communities?
Boy, I tell you what, it is a little scary. It's more than a little bit scary. Now, Jacinda, I know that you work a lot with the African American churches in the community. You're working very carefully to ensure that minoritized patient populations have access to vaccines, that they know what's going on with the influenza vaccines, the COVID vaccines, and others. I'd love for you to just tell us, how do we make sure that we're getting vaccines in these communities, and are individuals in minoritized communities at higher risk of the flu than other individuals?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dean Hogue. And actually, I've been working and providing education as, a pharmacist in Black communities to promote uptake and to just educate about why it is we need to be vaccinated against influenza and COVID-19 and what this season looks like. And while we don't have numbers for how this current flu season is impacting racially and ethnically minoritized communities, we do have numbers from last year. And we can state that hospitalizations for influenza have been the highest amongst Black individuals. So 78.2 per 100,000 individuals, roughly 80% higher than their white counterparts. So we can see that while we don't have the numbers, that it's likely that it is going to disproportionately impact these minoritized communities. So when we're thinking about just vaccine uptake, that's another thing that we have to consider. If we're seeing these large numbers that I previously talked about in the communities at large, please believe that we're seeing large numbers, in minoritized communities for the reasons that we saw with COVID-19, the lack and ability to social distance, the necessity of having to occupy these essential jobs, the low access to healthcare, the low access to accessible models that allow for the provision of these vaccines. So in the last 10 flu seasons, Black individuals, Hispanic individuals, and Native American individuals have been 50% less likely to have received a vaccine against influenza. So this is terrifying, and it's terrifying for me as I'm looking at this very, very bad flu season that we previously described. So I think that as pharmacists, we can, very simply, when we see a patient of a minoritized background come into the pharmacy, we can make sure, hey, let's pay extra attention. Let's make sure that we check in as to whether they receive their flu vaccine. Let's make sure that we can, in some way, deliver culturally competent key points to kind of engage that conversation of, hey, it's a bad flu season out there. Have you considered receiving the flu vaccine if you haven't gotten it? Or on a macro level, one thing that we're doing in our community is I've been going to Black churches, that being built from just the previous infrastructure that we had with COVID-19, utilizing Black pastors or working with Black pastors in partnership to increase education pertaining to the vaccines. So we've been able to go ahead and promote this education for the vaccines with the Black pastors. And we've been talking about just how important now it is to get vaccinated against influenza. I've been able to explain the impact that the influenza virus has had within the communities. And I've really been able to say, here we have vaccines, we have things available. We don't want to see this flu season be dire in our community.
Right. Absolutely. Well, CDC's ACIP did change their recommendations for flu this year. We talked about it on our last episode, but I just want to reiterate the highlights of that again. There are so many flu vaccines now. There used to be just a few, and we didn't have to think too much about this, but there are some things that manufacturers are trying to do now with flu vaccines to help them work better. Can you just quickly give us an overview of what the manufacturers are doing with flu vaccines in terms of formulations to help make them work better against preventing the flu?
Absolutely. I would love to do that. And one thing about it, I trained in antimicrobial resistance, but I can tell you that learning about vaccines has been a joy because it's just so much amazing science behind how these vaccines are created. So first and foremost, we have our high dose vaccines. So we know that we have our quadrivalent vaccines, which allow for us to have this representation of the different strains. But when we have the higher dose, we're getting more of the antigens. So now we have an increased ability to make just a robust immune response against those variants and the strains that are included in that vaccine, which is just so important for us being able to handle this very hard flu season. We also have adjuvanted vaccines, which once again are increasing our immune response, allowing for us to make that power punch immune response against this very bad flu season that we're seeing. But I think the best, maybe as a bench scientist that I'm really loving, is the recombinant vaccine. So I think the recombinant vaccine is just amazing because we're moving away from having to use that egg technology. We're moving away from being dependent on the viruses that can be picked up and easily integrated into the eggs that we're using. Well, now we are able to put just that exact information that we need from those strains.
Yeah, and I think, maybe for many of our pharmacist listeners to this program or farm techs or students that are listening to the program, they may have not realized that traditional flu vaccine manufacturing processes in hen eggs actually results in a little bit of genetic variation as you're trying to produce the vaccine. So this recombinant vaccine that's now recommended for use in people 18 years of age and older as an option in addition to our standard vaccines. Tell us a little bit more about recombinant technology. So it's not produced in eggs. How does this work and what's different about it? And why is that an advantage?
Exactly. Yeah. So it is absolutely not produced in eggs. So one, that's the really big difference because that's how we have a lot of our vaccines are, just because it's easy to go ahead and integrate them and to make the vaccines and to make sure that they work through passing them through that process of growing that natural process of growing the vaccines and in the eggs. So then when we do that, though, we end up with, as you said, Dean Hogue, that just genetic drift or a bit of a difference in that sequence that we may have. But with the recombinant technology, what we're actually able to do is to have the actual genetic DNA that we need for the circulating variants or strains that we have currently with the flu virus. We talked about just the genetic variants, but more importantly, what we can have is just mutations that occur. So then once again, prohibit us from being able to maximize what it is that we need, that specific genetic sequence that we need of those strains. So I think that this recombinant technology kind of, in my opinion, echoes what we saw with the mRNA vaccines, just where we are in science and where we are to maximizing the protection that we can have against vaccines. Well, with vaccines anyway.
Well, yeah. And so I think the other thing that is important for us to recognize is that, in type A influenza, historically, if we look back over the last 30 years, type A influenza tends to cause much more significant illness in the U.S. We always have some type B influenza circulate every season, sometimes a little later in the season, but we have a little type B, which is covered in the vaccines. But type A influenza, for our listeners, is divided primarily right now, what we've seen circulate into H3N2 strains and H1N1 strains. And I think over the last 10 years, as I look at the data, it seems that in years where there's circulating H1N1 strain, the vaccine's efficacy tends to be much better. We tend to get a better effectiveness of the vaccine. In H3N2 years, this whole issue of genetic matching becomes a real problem. Just last year, we saw that it appears the vaccine was probably no better than about 30% effective at preventing the flu for H3N2. But this season, early data in this season, if I'm reading it correctly, tells us that while the predominant strain right now circulating is H3N2, it's a very significant portion of the circulating strains are H1N1. So this season looks like it's different. It looks like we've got both H3N2 and H1N1. So maybe you could talk a little bit, Jacinda, about how Flublok, the recombinant DNA technology, again, what is this going to help us with? Are there greater impacts potentially in this season that we might see from this recombinant technology?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dean Hogue. So exactly what you stated, what we'll be able to do is to accurately have that H3 encoded into that vaccine. We'll be able to accurately have that H1N1 encoded into that vaccine. So irrespective of which one is that prominent strain, we'll be able to have them there because the recombinant technology has accurately placed them there. And then we don't have any degradation that we may not even account for because of the fact that we may have used the eggs to grow those various viruses. So I think that that is just so important. And it's going to be so important because I think the key to using vaccines as the prevention mechanism for this particular flu season is going to be accuracy. And I think that that's what's going to put us there as a recombinant. And I really appreciate that you drove home just that, well, we had the vaccines, but we saw that it was only about 30% effective for what we saw circulating. And that just drives home the point of we need to maximize the accuracy. And I think that that vaccine allows for that.
And so let me just build on that. Jacinda, you're on a roll here. Let me just say you have a patient that walks up to you in your pharmacy and someone says, you know what, why should I even take a flu vaccine? I mean, the reality is it didn't work very well last year. Why should I waste my time this year getting a flu shot? What do you say to the person who comes to you with that objection?
Absolutely. And that is a great question. And honestly, one that I get all the time. Usually it starts with, well, I've never gotten the flu before. So why do I have to get the flu vaccine? And I think that I would start with, first and foremost, I'm a big numbers person. I don't know if it's, the Virgo in me. I don't know if it's the scientist in me, but I am a big numbers person. I start with, this is the number of infections that we're currently seeing. So while you may have not have gotten flu before, I can tell you it's probably about 3.7 million people that probably said, I've never gotten the flu before as well. And now we're seeing just that mass amount of infections in a single month. So imagine what it's going to continue to look like. Then I tell them of those infections, 1 million of those people are having to go to the hospital. So, I mean, this is serious. So you want to think about how serious is this? Do you want to be the person that experiences the serious effects? But then also, if that doesn't work, I explain to them. And then I also get the pushback of, and, we as pharmacists aren't the only people that know that the vaccines weren't necessarily exact last year. And we know that you still can develop the flu irrespective of being, vaccinated, because we didn't previously have these vaccines that were so accurate, that were able to really account for what it is that we needed to see for those strains. So I tell them about the recombinant vaccine, like what's available now. And then I kind of use COVID as my gateway to start having this conversation, because I think the mRNA technology is something that's so novel. And I just continue to explain to them. And I say, well, remember how we talked about how the influenza vaccines didn't work so well? Well, guess what? Now we have this just advanced technology for vaccines to make them work even better. We saw that with the COVID-19 vaccines and the mRNA technology. And now we have these recombinant vaccines that are going to allow for us to be better protected against these strains that we see for flu. So that's another consideration, because this season, your protection may look a lot different than it did in the previous seasons that you may have received the vaccine. So I think we have to make sure that we list out just the advantages from getting the influenza vaccine. What are the advantages here?
Absolutely right. And I think it's also just important in that 1 minute or moment that you have right at the counter to be able to say, make a firm recommendation. Just say, Mr. Jones or Mrs. Smith or Mr. Patel, whomever is standing in front of you, you just say, look, the last year, the circulating strain of flu was different than what we're seeing this year. In fact, this year we're seeing at least 2 and maybe 3 flu strains circulating at the same time. You need to be protected. You need to do everything you can to protect yourself against the flu, and I strongly recommend that you get the vaccine today. A strong recommendation from a healthcare provider is the most likely thing to get someone to take the shot, and that's been my experience at least. And I've observed you in action, Jacinda, and I know that's how you do it too, and you're really firm in your recommendation. Let me ask you one really important question. Our time is running very short, so I want to really get onto this one because this is important. We're seeing this high increase right now in flu that's taking off. And even in the last week or two prior to the recording of this podcast, we've even seen a little bit of an uptick in COVID. So you may have some people coming into your practice asking for a flu shot. You may have some people coming into your practice asking for a COVID vaccine. I still sense a lot of hesitancy among patients and among healthcare providers of giving the 2 vaccines on the same day. What is there to be concerned about? What is your recommendation, and why do you make the recommendation?
So I will start with stating that my firm recommendation is to receive both vaccines on the same day. And my recommendation with that is I think about, well, what could be the collateral effects? I don't like to say collateral damage, but what could be the collateral effects of receiving the vaccines on the same day? Well, the biggest thing is that the side effects are not additive, meaning that if you are 8% likely to have side effects after influenza, and then maybe 8% to experience side effects after COVID, it doesn't mean now you're 16%, more likely to have those side effects. It's not additive there. And I will tell you that I have actually personally received the vaccines on the same day. That's typically how I like to proceed with that. And I had side effects that were just representative of having been vaccinated. I can't tell you if it was more so because I received the flu, because I received COVID. I don't know. But none of them were different than what I experienced previously with being vaccinated just in general. And they subsided quite quickly. So I will say that. What I will say is that if you do get them at the same time, I personally prefer not to get them in the same arm. I do one vaccine in one, the other in the other arm. And that's just for my own personal preference, my own personal comfort. It just makes it a bit hard to move my arm and use it, especially my dominant arm, and use it for what it is that I need to do. So I just do separate arms there. And then I think that one thing that I like to drive home is, well, if you are going to experience those side effects from the vaccine, are you going to be likely to jump on that boat and just say, okay, I want to go get another one 2 weeks later, or, so on? Likely not. So while you're there, you can get both vaccines at the same time. Actually, in the clinics that I lead following our town halls that we do in the Black churches, we offer both vaccines, and we do offer them at the same time. And it's for that ease of the patient being able to be protected against both of those respiratory viruses simultaneously. Because one thing that I want to make sure we drive home is that at the end of the day, when your body is fighting one respiratory illness, it's very easy for you to be susceptible to contracting another. So we just want to make sure that we can protect ourselves, at least with the vaccines that we have available to us, as best as we can.
Well, that's great. Well, I want to thank VaxServe for sponsoring our podcast today, making it possible for us to have this conversation. I want to thank you, Jacinda, for being here and giving us this information. And I want to thank you, listeners, for listening in. I hope you found this incredibly useful. I know I enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you did too. Hey, tune in for one more episode when we're going to discuss effective immunization consultations and approaches for improving the immunization rates. We're even going to talk about the link between influenza and heart attack. And boy, that's going to be a great discussion because most of you may be unaware of that. A list of references and resources that we've used for today's podcast are going to be available to you in APHA's Learning Library. And lastly, keep an eye out for all the information that's coming out from APHA, future events and podcasts, always available at pharmacist.com, your reference resource on the web. Again, thank you for joining us. For every pharmacist, for all of pharmacy, stay healthy and vaccinate all year round. Take care and have a good day.